To moderate the session, please welcome Cheryl Cole. She is the editor of Diversity Q, which is a news and analysis website that covers all aspects of diversity in the corporate world. Over to you, Cheryl.
So thank you, Dylan, for that impressive introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening if you're here with us in London. I'm really excited to be here, and we have a great panel lined up for you this afternoon. I'm Cheryl Cole, and I've been a financial journalist and corporate communications specialist for over 25 years. And I'm currently the editor of Diversity Q, a platform launched just over 2 years ago now to provide businesses with a greater understanding of what diversity and inclusion means in the workplace, and to some extent provide information and solutions they can use as a guide along their D&I journey. To support that, earlier this summer, I published a Diversity Q FTSE 100 Board Diversity Report, looking at the makeup of the top 100 companies in the UK. Needless to say, there are no surprises there. For example, in the banking and capital management cohort, just over 35% of the board members were women, but only 3 of those women held executive positions. Around 10% were from a BAME background, but only 1 BAME member had an executive role. As I said, I've been blessed with a wonderful panel, and we're going to discuss whether, given that we've been discussing diversity and inclusion in workplaces for decades, and in the UK in particular, more formally for 10 years since the introduction of the Equality Act 2010, should we now be looking at bringing in more new mandated legislation to get companies to act faster and in more meaningful ways? This October happens to be the 10th anniversary of the Equality Act 2010 in the UK, which was launched to provide a framework, a level of protection against bullying and harassment, but also provide more equal opportunities for underrepresented groups in the workplace. It's made a difference, but that difference is small and not equal across all sectors. We know, for example, that the asset management industry has particularly struggled with both gender and BAME representation across senior levels. Asset managers are the capital owners in the world, yet in the US, only 8% of the sector are women, 2% Hispanic and 1% Black. And you can paint a very similar picture in the UK. To close that gap in the UK, in 2017, the UK introduced mandatory gender pay gap reporting, which is loosely enforced. And there is still talk of launching mandatory ethnicity pay gap reporting, which will go some way in encouraging organisations to shine a light on the makeup of their BAME employees in senior positions. There are also hard and soft laws governing board-level gender representation involving quotas and targets, which have widely been adopted in Western Europe and more recently in California. And there is proof that this approach benefits an organisation. The question is, do we need more enforceable legislation that will enable us to move the dial? With me today are co-founders of Radiant ESG, Heidi Ridley and Katherine McDonald, Sally Shlomo, former People Director at Chartered Insurance Institute and currently interim head of Inclusion and Wellbeing at Sherman & Sterling, and Justin Onekwezu, Fund Manager, Head of Retail Multi-Asset Funds at Legal & General Investment. I welcome you all. We're going to be looking at whether diversity should be forced. But before we move into that panel session, I want to ask them to quickly give us an introduction. Tally, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you for the invitation today. So my background as an HR professional spans insurance and financial services for nearly 2 decades. I've been leading on diversity, inclusion and wellbeing for most of that time, even before it became mainstream that here we are talking about D&I and wellbeing. As an HR professional, fundamentally believe inclusion, diversity and wellbeing is critical if our people are genuinely our biggest asset, which they are, and creating a culture where we strive to be our best and to deliver and support organisations to be sustainable. And I'm very fortunate to sit on several advisory boards, ranging from mental health wellbeing to Afro-Caribbean and also age diversity, each one of those looking at the core areas on how we can support diversity and inclusion in different parts of the industry, financial services being one of them. Thank you.
And I'll go to Justin next, actually.
Cheryl, so my name is Justin Onekwezu. As you mentioned, I am the head of retail multi-asset funds and a fund manager here at Legal and General Investment Management, one of the largest fund managers in the world, managing personally, I'm managing around about 6 billion in retail fund money, typically dealing with financial advisors. And then I suppose on top of that, I co-chair the networks here at LGIM, the employee networks, which are empowered to help to drive policy. And outside of LGIM and L&G, I also am an ambassador for the Diversity Project, and I am part of a movement called Talk About Black, which aims to create more Black leaders within asset management, but also beyond.
Thank you. And Heidi.
Thanks, Cheryl. I'm Heidi Ridley. I'm a 30-year veteran of the asset management industry. I spent the last 18 years at Rosenberg Equities, a pioneer in quantitative investing, and the past 3 years as the firm's CEO. I have always had a very strong focus on diversity, and in particular advocacy for inclusion, which I think is really the key to promoting diversity and unlocking its benefits. And I've recently co-founded Radiant ESG with my partner, Katherine, around the shared passion for promoting diversity and inclusion and the importance of incorporating ESG considerations into investment strategies. I also am a part of the advisory board for the Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership at UC Berkeley.
Thank you. And last but not least, Katherine.
Hi, and I'm Katherine McDonald. I am the co-founder of Radiant ESG with Heidi Ridley. I also came from Rosenberg Equities, where I was the head of sustainable investing. And my focus there was on ESG integration into our portfolios, as well as ESG research. My own background includes working and living in Australia for a period of time, which is a very ESG forward country in terms of investing practices. I'm on the board of the Responsible Investment Association of Australia as well.
Thank you. So I know from talking to various businesses that not everyone has a clear picture of what the law is or if any exists around diversity and inclusion. So Tali, can I start with you, just to get a broader understanding of the current legislation in the UK and US and how, if at all, they've enabled progress in D&I in terms of addressing the lack of diversity?
Yes, thank you. So as you mentioned in your opening remarks, in the UK we have the Equality Act 2010, which in effect covers 9 protected characteristics as we will know them, and they're defined. They range from age, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, and so forth. In the US, we have the Civil Rights Act 1964. Most recently in the summer, that's been extended to now cover sexual orientation and gender identity. Both pieces of legislation protects people from discrimination throughout what I would describe as the employee life cycle. So anything from attraction to promotion, up through their career progression in any part of their organization. And it's absolutely been a catalyst for change in the workplace, and it's amplified the education around each of the core areas as I've just described, from gender, sexual orientation, disability, and so forth. And I think and we've seen that most recently through the Civil Rights Act, most recently in the summer from the Supreme Court, extended to now recognize sexual orientation and gender identity. And what I think is really important is that we now start to recognize that whilst progress has been made from a level of protection as a catalyst from the legislation, here we are in 2020, and look, we're hosting an event purely on D&I, which tells us that we still have so much more progress in order to unlock talent and in order to create a place where people can thrive. So, and if we think back, women were permitted to vote way back in 1920 in the US and 1928 in the UK. And here we are talking about women in asset management. And I also would love to overlay it with women of colour, looking at the intersection, what is the impact? And I think when we look at the legislation, it's definitely created a level of protection. However, where we're at now is starting to identify what is the difference between diversity and inclusion. We talk about the two as though they're the same thing. And I think it's important that we start to recognize that each one is very different, and therefore the approach that we take needs to reflect each of those representations. So diversity is the representation of the organization. Are we representing the society and the clients that we serve? And inclusion is the degree to which you feel your authentic self is welcomed, and therefore enabling you to contribute and work in a really meaningful way. And why is that important? Are women supported to be their best and recognized for contributing in a meaningful way? And is there an amplified impact if you're a woman of color? And the data that you shared, Cheryl, right at the outset is staggering. It is staggering that here we are in 2020, that the asset management profession has actually gone backwards. When you look at the data, we've gone backwards. And what is fascinating for me is, whilst the legislation has created a level of protection, there is so much more work to be done on the inclusion element of the D&I.
Yeah, it's true. There is so much work to do. Katherine, I want to ask you then, does a top-down drive to promote D&I accomplish anything then more than a tick box exercise? Because we've seen a lot of work happen in the industry across all sectors actually, but nothing's changed.
Yeah, and this is really the question that we're asking ourselves right now, is how do these top-down initiatives, they have pros and cons, but what do they ultimately accomplish, and do they go beyond this, box ticking exercise, as you mentioned? And what we've done is looked at, 4 sort of different types of initiatives. The first are the most obvious, the country level quota or comply and explain laws that are largely focused on corporate board representation of women. But we can also think of top-down initiatives as happening within companies themselves, and a different way of thinking about investor-led initiatives that are, very recently extremely diversity focused. Those can also be thought of as, top-down, using air quotes, and that they represent an exogenous force that is working upon a company to elicit change. Finally, I think it's important that we look outside of finance to other examples. We have many societal examples of mandated inclusion or mandated diversity. What can we learn from those exercises? So kind of in order, let me, talk about the pros and the cons. Certainly the quota systems at the country level have given us increased female representation on boards, but they have not produced the kind of knock-on effects that one might have anticipated. There was not an increase in diversity amongst management ranks. It didn't seem to narrow the pay gap in any measurable way. And I think also very importantly, even though we have a pretty short window of time to work with for study, that they have not given rise to a lot of the economic benefits that we typically associate with diverse groups. And so we ask ourselves, okay, given that these quotas and comply and explain, has been largely focused on board level diversity, what might it be about the boards that has, not given way to the kind of benefits that we might have wanted to see? And the thing that we are left with is that it could very well be a question of inclusion at the board level. Certain boards are much more egalitarian than others, soliciting opinions from the diverse group, welcoming even dissent when necessary. Whereas we know that many boards are simply hierarchical, and you can pack that board with as many, as much diversity as you want, and the economic positive impact simply wouldn't be there. If we turn our focus to what happens within organizations, there's a lot of research to back up this idea that some of those early top-down mandated diversity measures that were very oriented around negative reinforcement, those actually have the effect of dampening diversity in the workplace over time. And so what we see as being much more effective are initiatives that really try to reinforce what we call a culture of inclusion. Again, a culture that emanates from the top down, very importantly, that actively seeks the remedy to groupthink. And if that's our starting point, then this culture of inclusion will percolate throughout the organization, and the benefit of diversity will actually be felt. We are very much in favor of these investor-led initiatives, whether it's big investors going their own way or these, coalitions of investors that are coming together to push companies to improve on their diversity profiles, primarily because we see them as moving away from a sole focus on the board and more of a focus on organizational diversity, diversity that permeates the organization. So finally, just thinking, I'll use the Rooney Rule, which is an American football rule, but the Rooney Rule is a great example of a mandated diversity initiative that's completely outside of finance. So the Rooney Rule requires that minority candidates be considered for head coaching positions in the National Football League, which is our professional football league. And in its beginning, there were actually we could point to great improvements. There were a number of head coaches that were from minority ranks that came and rose to the position of head coach, attributable to the Rooney Rule. But over the past couple of years, we've seen that fall off, and we wonder why that is. And, in summary, we believe it's because the rule is simply too narrow. It's only focused on head coaching jobs in the professional league. We believe that this rule needs to be extended to assistant coaches, to the college leagues, so in this way, it's a good example of the lack of breadth, the narrowness of the law that has, we think, led to suboptimal results. So in summary, let me say that top-down initiatives can be effective, but they should be broad in scope, and they absolutely must be backed up by a culture of inclusion if they are to really take hold and give rise to the economic benefits that we know are possible from diversity.
I absolutely agree with you there, and I really do like the sentiment about a culture of inclusion. And that actually takes me to a question I have for Heidi, which is, Heidi, I know prior to founding Radiant, you were the CEO of a quantitative firm that had a very unusual diversity profile. How did you manage to do that? Can you share some perspectives on how you maintained it?
Sure. I think that, you're going to continue to hear the theme of culture of inclusion. So I totally agree with Talia that basically D&I are kind of lumped together as one thing, and inclusion is really the important aspect of that, because I think that you can try to achieve a diversity profile, but if you don't have a mechanism to draw the best out of those resources, I think you're going to really struggle. It is not easy to achieve if a team or a company wasn't formed with those values as a foundation. And even if it was, I definitely think it has to be nurtured and not taken for granted. And I mentioned that Katherine and I were very fortunate to spend 2 decades at a quantitative firm that had very naturally organic diversity. It was actually launched with a quite interestingly diverse team. That's not to say that we didn't work hard to not only maintain that, but to foster it and cultivate its benefits. So when I took over as CEO 3 years ago, close to 70% of our senior leadership team was comprised of women, and our staff more broadly represented 19 different countries. So for us, diversity extends far beyond gender. It's really a mosaic of backgrounds, of experiences, of skill sets, of cultural upbringing, perspectives, so on and so forth. And we've been, really firm believers that in order to thrive and navigate the changes that come from, an ever-evolving landscape, you need to tap into a broad range of viewpoints and skill sets and experiences and approaches, and be able to reflect the changing needs of your clients. So how do you get there? First, by understanding why diversity matters and what the benefits are, and ensuring that everyone in the organization understands that it's a prerequisite to long-term success. Second, by acknowledging that it's not straightforward to achieve. It takes work from the village and its leader. And importantly, D&I is a business imperative, not an HR initiative. And that requires consistent tone from the top, but also widespread buy-in from the organization. You may not be able to mandate it, but you can certainly model it. Third, recognize that it's an ongoing effort. If a strong orientation toward inclusivity and collaboration is not already woven into the fabric of the firm and its cultural foundation, it will require some structure and formalizing programs that help keep the discipline and the practice going. Finally, because culture is part of a live and dynamic ecosystem and formed through unspoken behaviors and mindsets and social patterns, how a firm's culture and its views toward diversity and inclusion are evolving has to be constantly monitored and managed. It does require a true commitment, but I will say that if the effort is authentic, it does come about more organically and it doesn't feel like work.
It's thank you. Funny you said that, because I know Justin's been doing a lot of work over the last 2 years to bring about that culture of inclusion within the investment industry. Jessie, can I ask you, what kind of initiative have you seen work, and tell us a little bit about the things that you've been doing as well?
Okay, so I think the first thing is when we focus on leadership, we have gone slightly beyond, or we have gone beyond the board level discussion. And actually we're thinking about investment leaders, those that are actually risk taking and taking money in the investment industry, but also those who are revenue generators, typically on the distribution side. And the numbers are really frightening, right? So Citywire did a global study in 2019, and it showed, across the world, 10% of fund managers, people who are risk takers managing money, only 10% are women. New Financial did a report in the UK in 2017, so a little bit dated now, but they could only identify 12 Black fund managers in the whole of the city in institutional fund management. Only two of those Black fund managers were women. So the numbers are really stark. And I think when you start looking at investment leadership, typically what you tend to find is those investment leaders tend to then move into senior roles within, CIOs, CEOs at a later stage. I think that is really, really important to take into consideration. So a few things that we've done. Firstly, within LGIM, it's probably worth talking about first. We've increased maternity and paternity leave. I think that's really important. That maternity penalty for women is really evident, and it's actually only since 2003. Going back to the regulation point, only since legislation point, only since 2003 have you seen paternity leave in the UK. So it has moved on, but clearly there's still a lot more to go. We've increased healthcare benefits right across LG. I think that's really important. That breaks down that kind of social mobility barrier. Initially, it was only for senior people. Or senior people within the business. It's now spread right across the business. And then thirdly, we've empowered the networks. I think this again is really important. Empowered networks to actually contribute to overall policy. So they're no longer just a group that would meet up in the evening for drinks. We actually ask the opinion of those marginalized groups to have an input into policy. So that's something, but it's wider than that. And I think if we're going to address this issue, we have to look at it cross-company, break down those competitive barriers, so to speak, and all work together to create true diversity and inclusion. So the areas that I've been focusing on from the industry perspective have been around ethnicity, and in particular in this movement I mentioned called Talk About Black. And what we've identified are these kinks in the hose pipe. And these kinks, they stop the talent from flowing through. So pipeline, entry, progression, and taboo. Pipeline in that, the social mobility and ethnicity is very hard to detangle. Entry is that, even when Black people are getting the right grades and getting the right qualifications, they're still not getting into particularly revenue generating roles. So I think those two are the diversity side, but then progression and taboo, they're the inclusion side. So progression is, once you get into a business, what we're finding is that, microaggressions, we're finding that barriers are stopping this talent from flowing through. And you tend to get to the kind of 7-year to 10-year point, and people are not progressing past that level. And finally, taboo, it's just simply not spoken about. People are less so now after what's happened this year, but typically ethnicity is not really discussed, or wasn't really discussed that much in the workplace, particularly in the UK, but more so it has been in the US. So what are the solutions? So firstly, on Pipeline, we've created an after-school program, and this is effectively helping those in deprived areas and marginalized areas learn about investing, learn softer skills to complement the skills they're learning in the school. Entry level is quite a saturated market anyway, but we've created an annual student program connecting talent to the different asset managers. In terms of progression, I think this is where most of the efforts, I think, really need to be focused. It's mentoring, it's interventions. We do mentoring circles on a monthly basis, sitting down with typically people of 0 to 5 years experience and helping them navigate the corporate environment. The last point to mention, and it's a really important point, is that the gender movement that we've seen in asset management, such as the 30% club, for example, in the UK and actually globally. What that has led to is led to a platform to have discussions about wider diversity. It's also set a standard of where we all need to get to in order to think about true diversity across different strands. And I think that has been really important.
This is a question for all of you, really, but maybe I'll start with Heidi. So Heidi, why do you think a lot of organisations are still struggling to achieve their diversity goals?
Yeah, where I see firms fail is, I guess, any combination of the following. One, it's not a strong or shared belief within the senior ranks. The executive suite may talk about the importance of diversity, but as we all know, employees look to unspoken behaviors, mindsets, and social patterns to assess the real truth. And Katherine touched on this a little bit, but in my mind, a core problem is that people at the top do not genuinely welcome dissent. They want a bunch of yes men or no conflict. And this comes through loud and clear to staff who then model the groupthink that they see gets others promoted. Another is that for many firms that embark on a quota-driven strategy to improve the slate of diverse candidates and broaden their recruitment efforts, it's a bit of chicken or the egg. If women just see a sea of male faces and can't envision a path to growth within an organization, it's difficult to attract them, and that goes the same for minorities. At the same time, firms that manage to bring on diverse talent may struggle with retention and inability to promote women and minorities throughout the organization if the cultural aspects we touched on earlier of the firm are not aligned to draw out the best of diverse employee base. If you don't work hard to get all the dimensions right, true belief that diversity is valuable, tone from the top, alignment throughout the firm, a culture of inclusivity, and proactive efforts and programs to develop all talent within an organization, I'm afraid we're going to continue to have these types of discussions with little progress a decade from now.
Yeah. Tally, and what do you think about that?
I would agree, and I think to build on that and touching on kind of what Katherine mentioned earlier on about the Rooney Rule, just let's take that as an example. Whilst these initiatives work initially, what we find is by having just one, for example, one woman of colour on your shortlist will not make a difference. It's the rules of probability. We need to work on extending that and having a broader talent pool. And it kind of links really to what Justin was saying. So when we look at the entry level and that kink at the beginning, when we attract talent and diverse talent, we need to really have a more broader pool, because what our bias will kick in when we see a minority. And if it's just one candidate at the entry point, we tend not to appoint them. We tend not to even invite them for an interview. We tend not to engage with from an inclusive perspective. So that's the first area, I think, which is really important. It's about genuinely attracting the wider talent and having more than one person from a diverse pool. The second one is looking at your interview process. We are still interviewing from the 1980s. Is it still relevant to how we connect with another human being today to unlock that talent? So when you want to attract graduates, look at how they interact, look at how they want to have a conversation. How do we create that authentic dialogue so we can unlock that gem and beautiful talent and the potential? Let's start hiring on potential. The potential of being curious, the potential of wanting to learn, the potential and the hunger and being driven and being ambitious to connect. And I think what's really important is when we look at the hiring on potential, the likelihood is that we'll broaden our talent pool. Yeah. Secondly, I would also add, we have an amazing opportunity here when we look at ESG. Never has there been a time as now to look at the S, being transparent with our data. So I disclosed my ethnicity pay gap 2 years ago. And I've always spoken about ethnicity, partly because I identify from an ethnic background. And I think when I look at the conversation around ethnicity, there's such a level of uncomfortableness. But I do believe when we talk about diversity, inclusion, and create some actions around it and tangible actions, the only way we grow and deliver is by feeling uncomfortable. Even when you look at when you were at school, you felt uncomfortable your first day at school, right? But then you grow, you blossom. If you think about a flower, so it's the same concept in the workplace. It's the same concept when you look at ethnicity and women and all our different diverse categories and communities. And I think what's really important from ESG is social DS, right? So transparency of data. The data will only give us a narrative, but that narrative will help us build the actions around it. And if you look also in the UK, the gender pay gap, whilst it's been a great catalyst to shine a light, we've also gone backwards. And I think what's really important for me, the one action I would say to build on some of what Justin was sharing is, for me, is quality sponsorship. The advancements, once you're in an organization and you've been successful in entering the organization, is how do we promote you? How do we create opportunities for you to grow and prosper? Quality sponsorship. So someone who's an advocate for you and who really helps you navigate your way through, particularly in our investment profession.
So we've talked about firms struggling a lot to failing to achieve their diversity goals. And one of the reasons is that we have a lot of resistance from people within, and it means that we need more allies within businesses. And I know, Justin, from the campaign WIAM, you managed to achieve that. How did you go about doing that?
Shelley, you're right. Allies are really important. But I think what the WIAM campaign has really done, it moves you from the spectrum of simply allyship to true advocacy. By holding up your I am and saying what you are, effectively, you're starting the journey of actually doing something. And I think that is really important. Allyship isn't just holding up a flag. It's not a noun. Actually, you have to do something. You have to do something to improve use your voice, use your privileges to improve the experiences of other people. And I think that is the key thing that the I am campaign does.
So thank you, Justin. I've got so many more questions to ask you, but the audience does too. And we've had some really interesting ones come through on the chat. The first question is, which I think I'm going to actually put to Heidi. As more people work from home now and in the future, do you foresee drawbacks or benefits in fostering a culture of inclusion?
I would say you see both. The benefits, I'll start with those. I think, generally speaking, there is more flexibility, more productivity if you don't have a commute, you're not traveling on airplanes, which does impact family life as well. At the same time, I think that you do, in a strange way, get to know people a little bit deeper. When you're going to work, your personal life and your work life are quite separated. Whereas here, you're seeing me in my home, all of the panelists, and you get to know folks in a slightly more different, more personal way. I think that's at least been my surprise experience with all of this. On the flip side, I would say that right now, certainly what we've seen is that this environment has disproportionately affected women and minorities in particular. Women, continue to bear the brunt of, dealing with balancing family and kids. And I know for myself, I've been on Zooms and, my kid will track me down to make him breakfast or whatever. And it's a little bit harder, I think, for women to be able to separate and be able to focus on work. And that's something that I think we need to be very, very conscious of. And I also do think it's a little challenging to build a true sort of unified culture, especially when you have maybe newer employees, younger folks entering the workforce that haven't been at the company a long time. I think it's certainly easier if you've been at the company for a while and you've established the way that you work and people know you very well. I think it's much more straightforward than a new employee that's trying to get to know his or her colleagues. And again, there are ways to structure to make that happen, but I do think that is a little bit of a drawback of not having an opportunity to be in person together.
Yeah, I can imagine it's quite difficult, especially for people who are joining the company in this time. I don't know if, Tally, do you have any experience that you want to share there?
So I would echo, and to build on that, I'd say, when we build inclusive cultures, particularly for those who are onboarding and graduates who are starting out in their careers, the physical connectedness is so important. The corridor conversations, the coffee chats, the telephone calls that you would hear, the impact of their roles. And when we talk about inclusive cultures, it's the behaviours, it's how do we show up. And sometimes on video cams like today, it's really paying attention to the small distinctions that in the physical world, and when we are back in the office, the richness of that is so critical. So I think, when we move forward when we come out of this pandemic, a hybrid solution of part working from home, part working in the office will be a really nice balance. And hopefully one of the things that will come out of this as well is the more flexible work, breaking the stigma of flexible working for men. And that's a great way to start balancing the stigma and creating an equal playing field for men and women for childcare and also elder care.
Can I just add one thing? I think the companies that'll do really well are those that really support the infrastructure at home, because again, one of the experiences we had at my prior firm is a lot of the younger interns didn't have the home working setup. And I think that the companies that go out of their way to ensure that that's seamless for all of their employees will do really well.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. So thank you, Cheryl. So I do think that it really depends on the individual. I think, some people are, and it's not necessarily just thinking about it in terms of, let's say, extroversion and introversion, and say that introverts will struggle from working from home. What I've found actually is that some introverts actually prefer video calls rather than being in a team meeting and vice versa. But what I do think from an investment perspective is you get, and looking at the research that I do on different managers, fund managers as well, is that you do have different processes. And the managers that have been able to adapt their investment process to this new environment have been the ones that have really been the winners. And this is even managers that have had collaborative processes where it relied on discussion. They've been able to adapt and evolve their investment process. I think that in itself shows how strong the culture is if a team can adapt when they get these hurdles and challenges put in front of them.
Tally made an interesting statement earlier, which I want to ask you, Justin. Do men struggle more with the perception or the thought of working from home? The stigma.
Do they? I don't think so. I'm not really sure it's driven by males or females. I do think that overall, no matter what we say, there is still there's still definitely, when you think about the childcare, the burden of that still in our society does lie on women to a greater extent than men. So naturally, men, when it comes to things like setting times of meetings and so on and so forth, don't necessarily or may struggle to empathize with that. But what I have found is that in this period, most investment teams recognize now that actually going forward, this is going to be the norm. It's going to be the norm. You are going to have more people in investment teams working from home, and actually you have to make meetings more accessible for other people. I think what it was before was that teams used to say, well, actually, if you can't adapt to us, you can't adapt to our culture, then actually you're not going to be part of the culture. But now I think teams recognize they need to embrace all different types of people in order to attract and retain diverse talent. Therefore, they need to adapt their processes to the different people in their team.
Yeah. So the next question is, what did your firms do to harness the momentum of the Black Lives Matter movement to make lasting change and not simply allow diversity to be on the agenda in a fleeting way? Well, we'll go back to Justin. Katherine, if you could come.
Thank you, Cheryl. Well, first I'll talk about, I work for Elgin, one of the largest investment managers in the world. And Elgin actually has always taken diversity and inclusion seriously. I think they're seen as one of the leaders in diversity and inclusion, particularly in the UK, but I think globally as well. So what do we do around that the Black Lives Matter movement? Well, first of all, I think it was really important to reach out to the Black employees of the business and check they're okay. And I think that checking in process was really important if you want a true inclusive culture. Secondly, we upped the ante in terms of reverse mentoring. They supported me personally and supported the WIAM campaign, which was all about bringing together different ethnicities. And I think this actually, I think what that really signifies that it's not just about individual firms. This is a societal issue. And therefore, the only way we're really going to solve the kind of racial disparities is actually as a collective, by asset managers coming together and saying, what can we really do to really solve this problem? An individual firm can only make so much of a difference, but collectively as an industry, I think we can make a sizable difference to create a true level playing field for all.
And if I could just add, coming at it from a slightly different perspective, when we talk to our clients about the economic risk related to their response or lack of response to some of the Black Lives Matter stuff, they see that this is very important when it comes to their brand power, when it comes to speaking to their customers and consumers more generally. So I think that, what we're seeing is that movements like this have given rise to real economic consequences, for better or worse, for firms. And the lasting impact of it is that firms are having to sit up and take notice of this, and importantly, how they're responding to it. And so as investors, as consultants, as people in the industry, we can go to firms and ask them quite pointed questions about, what are you or what are you not doing? But I think that the biggest impact, the one that firms tend to care the most about, is when individual consumers vote with their dollars about what's important to them. And we've seen this quite clearly in Black Lives Matter.
I know that we're running short of time here, but I've got another question, which I'm going to just quickly put to Tally. Can an organisation that has no women in executive positions be successful in achieving true diversity?
I suppose we'll start, there's so much data out there. Let's start with the McKinsey report that clearly shows us for many years now that gender parity, gender on board, ethnicity on board, the return of investment is greater. We also know Centre of Innovation. There's so much data and research that's evidence that having women or people of ethnicity on board are more successful. I would also add to all of that, really to build on all the conversations that we've had, is what do our consumers want? What do our clients want? And something that Justin mentioned earlier on, we found from this time, reviewing the investment processes that have been in place, the power of having diversity of thought enables us to be more creative and enables us to address some of the very traditional processes that we've had in place. And the one way of doing that is having a diverse group of people. One of them will be women, and let's look at women who identify from the LGBT+ community, women of colour, women who might have a disability, women who have elder care and childcare. And I think and that's where the beauty of intersectionality comes in, and that we can really start to get the richness of diversity of thought. So I think, we can look at it from so many different angles, and we've talked about ESG as well, and the societal piece and why it's so important. So it's really about looking from the client perspective and what their expectations of us are now.
So we've actually officially run out of time, but I really want to get this question in before we go. This is to all of you. What do you believe is the most pressing D&I challenge in the investment industry? And if you had a magic wand, how would you solve it? And if you could all just give me a really quick fire answer to that question. I'll start with Heidi.
I guess my magic wand would make management walk the talk and not delegate D&I efforts to HR.
Okay. And Katherine?
Yeah, and my magic wand would be hopefully convincing people that diversity and inclusion is not about women and minorities taking jobs away from other people. It's about increasing the size of the pie for everyone.
And Tally?
Data, collate the data, share the data. That gives you a really good pivotal place to start, and then you can just keep building on it. Don't be scared to share the data.
Yeah. And Justin?
My magic wand would be to remove the apathy. Essentially, in order to create an inclusive culture, you need the whole of the business pointing in the right direction. But yet, despite the underrepresentation, despite the data which shows that inclusive teams do better, there is still the diversity agenda is still driven by too few people. So my magic wand would be to create a truly inclusive culture where everybody's driving in the same direction.
Thank you everyone. You've been a phenomenal panel. I mean, diversity and inclusion is such a complex issue, and there's so much more we could have covered, but you've given the audience some really tangible, valuable insights that they can take away.